Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tokyo Living Podcast. My guest today is Fabric founder and CEO, James Hollow. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam.
And thank you very much for hosting me here in your beautiful office.
It's a pleasure. It's really good to have you here in Nakameguro.
Yes, and if the viewers and listeners hear some sounds throughout the recording, we are directly under the train lines in Nakameguro, so that's what you're hearing, but it's a very cool studio, very cool spot you've got here.
Thanks a lot. It's not your stomach rumbling, everyone. It's the trains going overhead, yeah.
Mate, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your professional background, what brought you out to Japan, and also just a little bit about Fabric and what you guys are about.
Sure. So I've been in Japan now over 20 years, so I'll try and give you the short version. But obviously from the UK originally, studied physics at university, went into kind of marketing consulting and business consulting straight off out of university, studied in London. And then, because I was really into traveling, I managed to kind of wheedle my way into a role here in Tokyo as part of the program that the company was running. Thought I'd be here for a year, maybe 2 years. This was back in 2002. And then kind of fell in love with Japan, started getting on with the language, and let's say was not in love with the role that I had, or the company I was with. And then although I learned a lot from them and I was very grateful for the opportunity, but took the chance to set up my own company here in 2004 with a fellow British guy. Long story short, I've been an entrepreneur running my own business more or less since then. I've done a couple of exits and sort of build outs of companies. But to jump ahead to Fabric, Fabric is just over 2 years old. We are a sustainability and strategic design consultancy. And so basically we've set up Fabric to help companies sort of tackle and look at what they could be doing around sustainability. Our approach is to frame it as an opportunity. Obviously, I think as you've said, as we've talked about before, there's a kind of a responsibility, I think, to take action. But we also think that if that responsibility can be framed as a business opportunity, things are going to move faster. And so we are, first and foremost, we're insight-driven strategists, consultants. I think we particularly focus on human-centered design, so thinking about what it's like to be the human in the middle of the change or the program, whether that's the consumer using a new product or service, or the employee who's sort of feeling and being part of change within a company. Always trying to empathize with them and sort of be able to understand what it feels like from their point of view and use those insights to actually make it a better solution and to move things forward faster.
Yeah, fantastic. Now we've got you on today to talk about sustainability in Japan. Now the term sustainability is sort of relevant in pretty much every aspect of life, and I think that's appreciated now in a way that's sort of become exponential. You know, growing up, we understood that there were threats to the planet and environmentalism was a thing, but it was a thing that was relevant to scientists and something that the general public should think about. And that's really sort of just ramped up, and obviously everyone now understands the effects of climate change, for example. I know climate change is just a very small aspect of what we're talking about. But I think everyone now understands that the world is not in the great place, and drastic change and immediate change is required. I guess maybe if we can start just right at the basics. What is your definition of sustainability?
Oh, that's a great question. I should have this off the bat, right? So I think a lot of the time we work at different levels. So I think what's become the definition of sustainability at the national level is the SDGs. So they were introduced by the United Nations. I think there are a few sort of earlier versions, but sort of formalized around sort of 8 years ago. And that's been a really powerful thing. It's meant that all countries, basically, because it's been driven by the most sort of international organization that we have, they've had to snap into line with that definition. And we maybe could talk about later the implications of that for Japan, where they, because everything's a bit different in Japan, those definitions might not always sort of fit, or actually there's a sort of a literacy gap between how Japan's been thinking about it versus how the world now thinks about it. At the so SDGs, there are 17 of them. There are various different indices. The top 5 in Japan, that basically the UN, based on its research and the way it's defined it, the ones that Japan really needs to focus on, is action on climate change, life in the ocean, and life on land, and gender equality, and then a 5th one, which is basically partnerships for the future, which is actually really important, but something that's not necessarily something that a typical citizen could really sort of tangibly understand. At the company level, lots of the Japanese companies have kind of adopted SDGs as well, which is interesting because it's actually a kind of a national framework. It's designed for countries, not companies. Right. But because if it's a big company and you see yourself contributing to, say, to Japan's sort of efforts to close that gap and become a sustainable economy and society, then it does make sense to align its efforts up to that kind of national agenda. But that actually makes it quite hard for them sometimes to link it back to their core business model and for that to sort of scale. And so, they might look at obviously not just the top 5 SDGs, but other ones, and actually frame what they mean by sustainable in other ways. But if I talk about, let's say, a company that makes stuff that we might buy here, they might be thinking, well, how can we look at supply chain, how can we source our materials in a responsible way? And so, the sad truth is that most inputs into the things that we buy are come from, let's say, models or sort of supply chains which aren't sustainable, meaning the damage they're doing to the environment or the damage they're doing to people, to communities, cannot be sustained if we want to live in a kind of a planet that's basically allows for human life to thrive and other life. Then looking at that, when we actually use it, and when we're what's the impact during the use, and then after use, is it something that can be recycled, reused easily, or just sort of, if it can just be thrown away. And so taking responsibility for all of your sort of potential impacts as a company and making sure they fit within the boundaries that the planet has as defined by these frameworks. We can talk a little bit more about those. That's really sort of, from a point of view of business, it's actually driving all of the aspects of your business to be responsible in terms of your impacts. If we bring down to our level, every day, let's say, citizens in Tokyo, it's not maybe so different, but it's just trying to look at the impacts that we have and try and be responsible for those. We often can frame those in terms of, let's say, having a less of a negative impact, right? So, for instance, is the coffee that you buy potentially contributing to deforestation in, let's say, Western Africa or South America, where it's coming from? Now, it's really hard for you to know that, but there are ways for you to actually almost ensure that it's not having that negative impact. And we could also talk about lots of other examples as well in our lifestyle here. And then what happens to the products after we use them? What can we do to sort of limit their negative impact, or actually put them to good use? So I think fundamentally sustainability means leaving behind, so making sure that the planet's environment and the social context is stronger tomorrow than it is today, or at least no weaker. I think we now need to kind of go beyond sustainability and talk about regeneration. We're at that point where the planetary system and social models are broken, or they're in the process of breaking, and therefore we actually really need to talk about restoring things. Now, it might not be about like rewinding the clock and putting certain ecosystems exactly back to where they were, but I think it does mean basically changing a lot of our systems to let nature do its thing and create and allow its regenerative forces to create more life and conditions that favor life more life going forwd. So that's what you wanted, right? A 5-minute definition of sustainability.
So I guess Fabric have just released a report on sustainability in Japan, and I believe this is the third one that you've done, and this has just come out last week. What are some of the major sort of findings from that report in relation to the sustainability landscape in this country?
Yeah, thanks. So for the last 3 years, we've done an annual report. The first one was trying to take a baseline of basically where Japanese people are at when it comes to sustainability. I mean, we felt that data wasn't really out there. There's a lot of sort of kind of myths and we felt maybe sort of unfounded assumptions. And so we just wanted to understand where that's at. And then in the second year, so this would be last year, we had that baseline from 21. And last year we sort of basically measured the rate of change. In particular, we've defined this concept of sustainability consciousness. That's basically, as consumers, as citizens, to what extent Japanese people are kind of aware of sustainability in their daily lives. So if you're someone who's, everything you buy, every brand you choose, every lifestyle choice you make has got, you're aware of your impact and you're trying to take responsibility for that impact, you're at the highest consciousness end. If you're someone who's basically, for whatever reason, it's not really factoring into kind of any decision you make, or just to sort of maybe the level of, well, you use the plastic shopping bags I get from the supermarket and try do the recycling like I should do, you'd probably be at the low level. Yep. There might be one kind of category where you're somewhat aware. Yep. It's that kind of level. Yep. And so that group is about, so in the 23 report, that group's about 58% of the population. Wow. And so then you've got we call light conscious and then moderate and high. So sort of between the light and high, you've got basically most of the rest, sort of the 38, something like that, percent at that. And so if you think, okay, what happens between that low group and the high group, let's say in terms of consumers, maybe someone at the high end of the low group, there's let's say we use the example of coffee, where someone's told them, actually, when coffee beans are grown, sometimes that can lead to deforestation. And you have some awareness of what deforestation is, and that's not a good thing, so you want to avoid that. So what do? Well, you buy coffee with you try and buy coffee with a fair trade accreditation, and that means that it's done, basically there are rules around how it's made. So that might be one area where you're now conscious, and you're sort of you've made a decision there about the kind of quality that you're going to expect and choose whenever you buy coffee. But you haven't really thought about what that means for chocolate or cars or electricity or other areas. By the time you get to high group, it's pretty much all aspects of your life. And so that sort of transition, and we kind of feel from the qualitative research that we've done, that people tend to sort of, their lives become steadily more, let's say, sustainable by just getting more knowledge and more consciousness in different areas of their lifestyle, particularly when it comes to choosing brands and options. But it could also mean from just not buying stuff, realizing that actually I don't need that. And that's another way of doing it. So that's a sort of a kind of gradation that we're seeing.
And what extent does sort of age and socioeconomic status and that sort of thing affect the level? Do you see different subgroups being in different levels?
Yeah, this area is really fascinating because you kind of hear, you imagine, or you have an impression of what it's like in America or Europe, Australia, where it's the Gen Z, the younger generation who are kind of inspired by Greta Thunberg to be activists and sort of are driving it. Whether that's true or not outside of Japan, it's really not true in Japan. We actually find by the way that we measure consciousness, which is pretty broad, it's actually the baby boomers, that generation that's most conscious. Right. And because actually there's more of them in Japan because of the structure of the population, that makes them actually possibly the most important consumer group. If you were essentially launching a brand that was designed to appeal to sustainable mindset, you would have to really think hard. The Gen Z have been taught SDGs in school. Like that started maybe a bit more than 5 years ago. So that sort of new cohort coming through out of school into university, they've got a kind of an education in sustainability that the elders don't. And actually sort of the lowest group is the millennials. So they're sort of in their 30s, early 40s maybe, and maybe they're feeling pretty squeezed by Japanese society. They may be the ones who are having to work hardest to like generate results at work. They may also have young children. And so a lot is being asked of them. And maybe, they just can't get on to working out what's the best coffee to buy when it comes to, sort of impact. And that's kind of, I think that was, if we go back to the last year, we really kind of came out of that thinking, there's this sort of concept that we hadn't addressed formally. In Japanese, the word is yoyu, which is kind of like having a spare capacity to do stuff and sort of a sense of ease. So you could talk about having yoyu in terms of time, or yoyu in terms of money, or yoyu in terms of just like emotional capacity and energy. And although we couldn't really statistically show it with our results last year, we kind of felt that yoyu was this sort of key sort of, if you've got it, you're more likely to be in the higher consciousness groups. If you don't have it, you're likely to be in the lower ones. And so this year, 2023, we really try to zoom in on that and understand what's going on there. And so we kind of addressed that formally through the concept of well-being. And we asked people to rate themselves on 8 dimensions of well-being. And I mean, what came out of that was that for the general population, their self-rated levels of well-being are really low, like shockingly low. When it came to the areas that, I mean, they were fairly consistent, but the ones where they were sort of, let's say, their well-being they felt was lowest was around financial and then sort of work-related career well-being. And so, I mean, this backed up another hypothesis that we'd had, which is that a lot of people are in roles which actually are not doing a lot for their psychological health, their physical health, their mental health, or just sort of helping them feel empowered and, let's say, kind of thriving humans. And that's something that actually can be changed. And if it could be, then that would kind of give them more of that yoyu, more of that capacity to actually like explore stuff and imagine what a different lifestyle might look like, or join communities outside of work or even in work where they could, give back, work on just sort of improving or looking at their own lifestyles. And so that's become a sort of a focus for our work this year. And it's actually really hopeful, and there are lots of good signs, but again, it's an area things really need to change quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think about the Japanese population in terms of wellness. Obviously, they have incredible longevity, but I think it's not surprising that that satisfaction with work and things like that. I mean, that is a little bit of the stigma with the Japanese work culture that I think people who live and work out here will understand.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of roles which aren't really using people's. Let's say they've been kind of turned into pretty robotic roles, and they're not really tapping into people's like humanity, their sort of essence as a human being. And obviously that's not easy to do, across the board for all companies, but still the levels in Japan are probably sort of like really low. Obviously it's not all companies, not every role, but in a country where you do have depopulation, they're determined not to fix that through immigration. The opportunity to basically put more focus on well-being, to sort of get the most out of those people, and for them to not just mimic sort of what machines can probably do more and more, but actually really tap into their innate humanity, their ability to come up with new ideas with each other, to channel their empathy with people around them, but also people for customers, but maybe people in other parts of the world. That's actually a really inspiring opportunity, and these Japanese companies have the resources to do it. And I think a lot of it, does come down to like lots of good well-being practices and lifestyle practices, which I'm sure you're more of an expert of than I am. But physical fitness comes into it, having good sort of mental health practices, reflection. These are all things that can be encouraged through work. I think there's an opportunity for companies everywhere in the world, but especially in Japan, to see themselves as a kind of a platform for human-oriented communities where people can help each other out more. But I think the drive really needs to come from the leadership, and for them to be kind of empathetic with the employees in their organization. But there are also just sort of really practical ways that they could help, let's say, suggest and sort of inspire their employees towards more sustainable lifestyles. So something we try to sort of prototype these in our office here, and so for instance, you've seen our the refill station, where we've basically provided free kind of complimentary body wash, shampoos, detergents that people can take home using a reusable bottle, and therefore eliminate sort of those, basically the plastic bottles that end up going thrown in the trash. It's really easy to do. People kind of go, it's hard for people to make that step on their own, but if you do it in a company here with 30 people, it's very manageable. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's a simple step that we can all take together, and it kind of feels good. And actually, when you there are lots of other things that you can do. One of the things that's actually been sort of surprisingly, let's say, transformative, maybe that's too grand a word for it, but actually, the food waste that we have after our events here, or just sort of after kind of getting a lunch, all of that goes into a composting system based on worms.
Right.
And so there were people in our team who basically found that whole idea pretty repulsive at the start. But when you sort of get into it, and you can see them and start touching them, and you see that basically they eat all of your waste food, and then what they create is this basically the most amazing soil, which we can then put on our plants here, or you can take home and put on your tomatoes or whatever. You can just actually sense that you're part of a kind of a regenerative system of life, and actually all of those things we're completely dependent on. And it's true that I think in our lifestyles today, we barely touch anything organic, right? If we didn't go out of our way here in an urban environment, you would just be on pavements and touching metal bars, and it's really hard, without sort of getting picking up like hobbies and being into things. But actually, that's kind of part of the problem, that in many ways we've lost our ability to empathize on a regular basis with non-human life, to really have a sense of awe, appreciation, and kind of wonderment for all the things that we depend on. And so these sort of simple ways that we can reconnect with that in our lifestyles actually are really important, and sort of make us more conscious, and make us kind of realize why we have the opportunity to make these changes, which will have an effect if we all do them.
I mean, obviously, as a health practitioner, the whole tie-in with wellness is really relevant, and I love the way that you've worked that in terms of the report, but also in terms of your practices as well. And just the things that you talked about now are really helpful for someone like me who's relatively uneducated on this topic. And obviously there's a lot of information out there, but it's sometimes difficult to find that information. I mean, what are some other little things like that people can be doing to gradually make their lives more and more sort of sustainable and contribute to a healthier planet? Yeah,
sure. I think so. Going back to that kind of, the solution can't be making people feel more crap about themselves, right? It
doesn't work in health and fitness.
It doesn't work anywhere, right? So that's never going to be the solution. So it's not our fault that we've ended up in, as individuals, it's not our fault that we've ended up in this situation where a lot of our sort of like behaviors are contributing to negative outcomes rather than positive. So sort of thinking about it positively and say, okay, what little steps can I take, and just sort of expanding your consciousness and your knowledge of like what helps and what doesn't, and just without getting anxious and sort of fretful, working away at them and finding pleasure in that. That's really, I think, the kind of key. So I talked a little bit about the composting, and that, but you know, food. I mean, as much as composting is fun, it's not as fun as eating food. Like actually, there's sort of academic arguments for like the food basically being sort of defining our species and the human condition. Like, you know, whether it's using fire to prepare food so we don't have to use as much energy to digest, and we could therefore, from evolutionary terms, invest more on our brain development, and actually the whole sort of social interconnections that form around preparing food together, sharing food, could actually have been quite defining in our evolutionary history. And so I believe that actually just preparing and enjoying food together is kind of like a core human pastime, and is also luckily one of the biggest opportunities we have for agency as consumers. Food has actually a really big impact on the environment, our food systems. So if you think about all of the land that's used to grow our food, the systems which are used on that land basically vary from incredibly destructive and like polluting to regenerative. Sadly, most of them today are on the sort of the destructive side. So if you think they are using lots of chemicals and fertilizers, which basically have used a lot of energy to create them, and then all of that energy goes up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and then using chemicals into the soil, which get washed off and create dead rivers and dead oceans, not to mention have a negative impact on human health all around it. So being really careful about where your food comes from and what system it comes from. The other great thing about food is that actually the more healthy the ecology that the food comes from, the more likely it tastes good. So there's this great kind of correlation between healthy ecosystems, healthy farmers and farm communities, and great tasting food. And so really sort of leaning into that, I think, is like a great win-win for everyone. And so, you know, organic is definitely better than non-organic. Look out for basically farmers who are trying to encourage and nurture biodiversity on their farms. Outside Japan, it's still relatively small, but the regenerative and organic certification and the sort of regenerative movement is really growing pace. You're starting to see that in Japan. But also there are lots of farmers markets and just sort of trying to find ways of knowing where your food comes from. Here actually in Fabric, we have what's called a CSA partnership, where a community supported agriculture, basically a farmer who brings in their produce to a drop-off point, and monthly subscribers basically take a box of vegetables away. That's a great way to get to know where they're coming from. They're all organic, and basically they love animals and bees, and they don't want to have lives of just spreading chemicals and killing stuff. That's a really good way of getting into it, and you end up sort of basically the food tastes great, and there's kind of more meaning in it as well. And also it connects you to the seasons, because it makes you realize that half the things that are available in the supermarket shouldn't actually be there this time of year.
And you talk about trying to educate yourself about where your food is coming from, and how do you sort of recommend people go about that process of getting educated? Because like we talked about, there's so much information out there, you don't know where that's coming from, and but where's a good place for people to start with that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think rather than sort of putting websites out there, I would say that you probably know someone who's into this stuff, right? So be curious, like really try and like take them for lunch, or have them over, have a coffee, and sort of ask them like, okay, so this is an area I'm interested in. What would you advise? I think actually human relationships and communities are probably the most powerful. And it, also then when you get that, it kind of comes through a worldview, through a personality, through a kind of a lifestyle as well, which is always going to be more sort of enriching and inspiring anyway. There are sort of lots of, obviously there's lots of information out there. in terms of sort of like say how we connect to systems, that kind of it's very, I think, written in a way that anyone can understand, but still fairly sort of conceptual, would be a book called Regeneration by Paul Hawken, but with lots of different contributors. I think in terms of food, for instance, there's the omnivore's dilemma, which is really good. You could just also follow the Fabric Instagram, and we'll put stuff up on from our community library here, where we've got a bunch of stuff. But yeah, there's lots of books and references out there, I think people can get into from various stuff, and Google's pretty handy for all that.
Yeah. So in terms of what happens with waste in Japan, obviously anyone who's lived here, as they move into an apartment or residence in Japan, they've got this convoluted recycling procedure. Everything needs to be separated, which, depending on where you're coming from, that might be very different to what you're used to.
Yeah.
But in the grand scheme of things, how does Japan as a country deal with waste removal?
Yeah, and it can get quite technical. Yeah. And you can get various sort of different points of view on this. I mean, I think the recycling here is really important, and it does work. So if you think any kind of material that's used for packaging, that can be turned back into packaging, is good for the planet. So I don't know if you had milk bottles when you were growing up. We have obviously glass collection. Now that uses energy probably to reform the glass into a different shaped glass or a new one, but that's still a lot better than it going in a landfill. So it's good to keep to those recycling things. We also have cans and aluminium and stuff. Again, so those like metals can be basically reused as packaging. I mean, with some obviously reform, basically forever. So that's a circular system. So that's why they've been in place forever. It makes economic sense. They're valuable. When it comes to, like, say, other stuff like plastic, it becomes a lot more complicated. And so we could talk about this for a long time. But I mean, one thing to bear in mind with plastic is there's lots of different types of it. So I think when you look at how many, like, I think, what is it? It's like 20,000 PET bottles get sold every second in Japan or something crazy. So PET is a plastic which actually does have the potential to be reused. Like, so many of the films and stuff don't. PET could be recycled, but it's just better that we don't use so many as a society. And I think with refillable bottles and things that you can put in to make the water taste delicious, and that's what you should, if you want to make a change, that's a very easy one. What Japan does with its waste, so most people in Japan live in big cities. Hygiene is a genuine issue. It needs to get disposed of. So everything that goes in that mixed trash basically gets burned in a big incinerator that's run by probably your ward. And most wards actually have built infrastructure that uses, when they burn it, it creates electricity, which then goes back into the grid. And often they have what's called district heating solutions plugged into that. So the heat will be used to warm water, which will go into a central, like a heating system for a local swimming pool or for an old people's home. So it's actually the kind of, it's called waste to energy. And that system is actually, in terms of global infrastructure, pretty good. And if you look at the trends, say in the UK or Europe or the US, a lot of places are now shifting over to that, away from landfill. Because landfill, basically you're putting a lot of stuff in there often. Often the recycling in other countries isn't as good. So metals and glass and stuff is going in there. But also, when you put mixed food waste in there as well, it breaks down very slowly and anaerobically, which means it creates methane, which slowly leaks out, and methane's a very bad gas. So when it comes to waste in Japan, I'd say Japan's biggest problem with waste is how much it produces, not so much the way it, so actually the way it deals with it, it can definitely get better, and there are attempts to do that, but basically as a society we just use too much crap. I mean, we do not need to be using as much plastic, as much, you know, a lot of food is wasted. So obviously the plastic packaging is infamous. And I think try to reject that when you can. I mean, I know it's hard, like, you know, if you've got small children, there are certain things that are just such good lifestyle solutions, and they don't come in a ecologically sound solution at this point.
Yeah.
You know, so